You're listening to the Arkansas Flight Safety Cooperative podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. In this episode, we're going to discuss automation mismanagement and automation dependency. Now, this is a podcast that we're doing in a series of just monthly safety messages. So I'm going to do a quick 15 or 20 minute discussion over a safety topic. And this is going to be a way for you to kind of stay in tune with the safety culture that we're trying to build here in Arkansas, which is the whole point of AFSC, is to build a positive safety culture in our aviation world here in Arkansas. So I decided to start with this topic because it's something that I run into a lot, either on check ride. I also deal with this in the Air Force and in the corporate flying and Part 135 flying that I do, is either people being too dependent on their automation or mismanaging their automation in some way. Now, the danger of that is if you mismanage it or you become dependent on it, the automation can get you into an undesired aircraft state. It's kind of the technical term here, but that really just means that the plane's doing something that you don't want it to do. So in the newsletter that you'll see this month, I kind of say, I wish I had a nickel for every time I heard somebody say, "What's it doing now?" And if you've flown a plane with an autopilot long enough, you've probably heard that or said it yourself. And what that normally means is that you have done something incorrectly and not really recognize that until the plane starts turning and you don't expect it to. And you're like, "Hey, what's it doing now?" And the appropriate response to that, of course, is going to be to click the autopilot off. Let's de-automate the airplane, fly the airplane manually, and put it where we want to put it. Then, once we've got aircraft control maintained, we're going to then add automation back at the appropriate level when we understand, really what's going on. Now, part of the confusion is that the general aviation fleet right now isn't standardized at all, and I don't think it ever will be. Sometimes we're flying 1950s model airplanes, or we might be flying a 2022 brand new Cirrus, or a 2010 206 with a G1000. All of these airplanes are going to have different avionics layouts. So especially if you're a renter and you're flying planes with different types of avionics and automation, it can be really difficult. So you need to boil it down to the basics. So what are the basics? The basics of automation is really twofold. You want to figure out how your autopilot enunciates what mode it's in, right? So how do I know what my autopilot is flying? Is it in heading mode? Is it in nav mode? What type of enunciation does it give me to let me know what mode it's in? And the second one is my flight director nav source. Some airplanes have flight directors, some don't, but almost always you're able to tie your autopilot, your automation, to a navigation source. So what type of enunciations do I have for my navigation source? A great example that I bet most listeners will understand is the Garmin 430. So the Garmin 430 is a GPS unit, of course, but I can also track a VOR with it. So that CDI button is where I would look to see, am I in VLOC, which is VLOC, that stands for VOR localizer. So then I know the 430 is acting as just a regular nav radio, and I'm tracking to a ground-based nav aid. The other thing it could say is GPS, so that lets me know that the GPS is my navigation source. So that GPS is now tied to an indicator, either a CDI or an HSI. Again, it depends on your aircraft. But I need to be able to correlate, okay, my CDI indicator is tied to the 430, and typically that indicator, the little round dial with the two little lines on it, it's going to say VLOC or it's going to say GPS. So that's another enunciator that I would want to see. And I would want to verify that enunciator matches what I expect the autopilot to say. So if I was trying to track a GPS course, for instance, I would want my GPS to say GPS. I would want my indicator to say GPS, and I would want my autopilot to say whatever that autopilot supplement says it should say. And that sounds a little obtuse, and I'm not trying to be confusing, but the reason I say it that way is some autopilots I would expect to be in nav mode. Some autopilots might be in GPSS mode. There's a really common autopilot, the STEC 55, that has a nav button, and you actually press that nav button twice, and above it, it'll say GPSS. If you just press it once, it's in nav mode, and that's meant for like tracking a VOR or localizer. And if you press it twice, it goes to GPSS, and then it's tied to the GPS. So that supplement looks a little bit different than maybe, let's say, an S-Tech, I think a S-Tech 30 or 35. One of the older S-Techs, you actually put in heading mode, and there's a different switch somewhere on the panel that says GPSS. And so if you're going to fly a GPS course, you have to have the GPSS switch activated, the autopilot in heading mode, and the GPS in GPS mode. It can get really confusing, right? So you need to get comfortable with that supplement. And that brings up the next point of, what is a automation supplement or autopilot supplement? If you're flying an aircraft, and probably most of you are flying an aircraft that didn't come equipped with the autopilot that's in it right now, which means there needs to be a flight manual supplement for that autopilot. So you need to, first of all, locate where that is. It should be in the aircraft. It should be actually supplemented to the airplane flying handbook. Typically, I've seen them in some sort of 3-ring binder, and it's usually stuffed behind the pilot's seat, and usually nobody ever references it, and they don't really understand how their autopilot works. So that's a great place to start, is see what the supplement says on how you should configure that autopilot. Now, if you're, wanting some more practical practice on how to use that autopilot, you need to find a CFII that's knowledgeable in that particular setup of aircraft. And like I said, these can range the gamut between maybe a single G5 and a old GPS, or an HSI, an old King HSI, and an old, I don't know, maybe having an Apollo GPS, something much older, or you might have a G1000, or you might have a G3000. Who knows? In the newsletter this week that you'll see that I'm going to kind of release with this podcast, I equate it to energy drinks. So when energy drinks first came around, it was really just Red Bull. At least that's all that I remember. You go to the gas station, you see Red Bull. Now you go to the gas station, and I bet there's 4 or 5 of these, full refrigerator things full of different types of energy drinks. I mean, it is overwhelming, the amount of choices that you have in energy drinks today. And kind of our avionics have gone kind of on a similar path. It is overwhelming how many different flavors and types and combinations of avionics that we have in our general aviation fleet. And anytime that you have so many choices, it makes it very difficult to take consistent action in the cockpit. And so what I mean by that, I wish I could tell you a technique or give you a checklist that would mean you always know how to operate the autopilot in any airplane that you fly. But unfortunately, we have so many different options out there that that's impossible. So instead of being able to give you specific instructions on your particular aircraft right now, all I can do is tell you the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are know what mode you're in, know what the GPS is tied to, and have a repeatable way to check that. So, and this is where single pilot resource management comes in. If you're flying single pilot, you don't have a crew to help you remember what modes you're in. It might even feel silly talking to yourself about these things, but that's what I really encourage is you need to announce, hey, I'm in GPS mode. The autopilot is tied to the GPS. That needs to be part of your kind of a verbal call out that you're doing. And I like the verbal call out and actually pointing. There's some science behind being able to point and verbally call out. That'll help you kind of internalize what's actually going on with your modes. So far I've just talked about lateral modes in automation. The other mode that we have is vertical modes. And this is where things can potentially get even more dangerous. That's because a lot of these autopilots are capable of putting us into kind of an undesired aircraft state is the technical term. But it basically means that it can get the airplane into a stall or very close to a stall. Now, some of the newer autopilots, like the GFC 500 and 600, the digital Garmin autopilots, which are really, really good, they have, I believe it's called ESP, and it's a envelope protection system type thing. So if it gets you close to stall, it basically won't let you stall. It will automatically push the nose over to keep you out of a stall condition. A lot of the older autopilots do not have this feature, so it will take you into a stall or an approach to stall. And where that's going to happen is mismanagement of the vertical profile. So I'll talk about vertical profile for a little bit, but just know that it, again, depends on your aircraft and the avionics that it has in it. A lot of the older autopilots had an altitude hold, but they don't really have an altitude select ability, and very few of them had any type of vertical navigation mode. So it's more of you had to fly the airplane kind of by hand in the vertical until you get to your altitude, and then you can turn altitude hold on. Well, with more modern autopilots, and the STEC 55 is another example, it allows you to select, and you could fly maybe a vertical speed mode to an altitude, and then it would intercept that altitude. That's the type of automation sequence that you would expect, as an altitude select to an altitude hold. So here again, we have some sort of enunciator in the cockpit that's going to tell us what is our vertical mode right now. Is it altitude select? Is it altitude hold? Or if we're equipped, are we in a vertical nav mode? Now, with vertical navigation, we have a few different options on some autopilots. We can fly vertically in an indicated airspeed mode. We can fly in a vertical speed mode, or sometimes it's called a flight level change mode. Now, I think I got that a little backwards. The vertical speed mode is kind of by itself, and then your indicated airspeed and flight level change, or FLC. So it'll be labeled on most autopilots as IAS or FLC. Those are kind of used interchangeably. So what that means is we're going to fly an indicated airspeed. So the autopilot's going to attempt to hold that indicated airspeed during a climb or descent. Now, the best practices that most of these manuals will say, and what you'll find in some of the FAA guidance, is that it's typically better to climb in an indicated airspeed mode. So I might set my my cruise climb speed of 130 knots, for instance. So I set 130 knots on the indicated airspeed mode, go full power, and the plane's going to try to hold 130 knots in the climb, and it's going to pitch as necessary. The reason I like that is it's not going to get me too slow. So if I were to put it in vertical speed mode instead, so kind of contrasting that, is I go full power, I set a vertical speed of 1,000 feet per minute, and of course, as I climb, my engine, and a normally aspirated engine, but any plane for that matter, as you climb, you're going to be able to hold less and less of a vertical speed. So as I climb, attempt to climb at 1,000 feet a minute, I get higher and higher in altitude, and my plane has to fly at a slower and slower airspeed to maintain 1,000 feet a minute, and it starts approaching stall. So here's where my plane could put itself kind of in a power on stall configuration, using just the automation. And that would be an example of automation mismanagement, of using vertical speed in a climb could potentially put you in a power on stall condition. The other issue would be in the descent. So let's say I'm using a descent mode, and I've got the power pulled back, and I've got a lower altitude set on my altitude select. So let's just say I'm descending from 10,000 feet, and I'm going to level off at 5,000 feet. So I have 5,000 feet selected. I've reduced power so I don't get into the yellow arc. Let's say it's a little bumpy. And I start doing my approach checklist, my descent checklist, whatever it might be. I may be listening to ATIS, maybe making some inbound calls, whatever. I start looking at other things as my automation manages this descent. Well, as soon as we descend, it's going to go to altitude hold mode. Now, here would be the appropriate place for me to add power back in to maintain an appropriate, flying speed if I'm flaps up, for instance. But if I had the power pulled back and my plane levels off and I miss that, my plane's going to attempt to hold altitude. And as the speed decays, I'm going to get to a higher and higher angle of attack as the plane slows down. And again, my plane's going to approach a power off stall condition in this configuration, potentially, just because I mismanaged the automation. So that's an example of how mismanaging my climb modes or my vertical navigation modes of my autopilot could come back and put my plane in an unsafe condition. So the way to get around this is to have a repeatable kind of very well disciplined method of calling out the mode that you're in, verifying that that mode is indeed active, and then anticipating what's going to happen next. So this is a game that I always play with any instrument student that I do is I'll point at the autopilot and I'll tell them what mode is going to activate next. So that's a good question to ask yourself is look at the autopilot and think to yourself, what autopilot mode is going to be active next. If I'm on approach, if I'm on vectors to final, for instance, and I'm in heading mode, the next one I expect to see it is approach mode once I intercept that inbound course. If I'm in a descent mode, let's say I'm in a vertical speed descent mode, the next mode I expect on my autopilot is altitude hold, because I'm going to go from vertical speed mode descent down to the selected altitude, and it's gonna hold that altitude and go to altitude hold. Same thing for the climb. So that's just a simple question that you can ask, and if you can answer that correctly and consistently, then the likelihood of you mismanaging your automation goes way down. So I hope this has been a good discussion. Again, I don't want to be too long. Just want it to stay in your earbuds and kind of remind you of these safety topics. I'll be covering more topics in the future, and I would love to hear from you, the listener, from around the state, or if you're outside the state even and happen to be listening to this. Let me know what kind of safety topics you would like to hear next. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and don't forget to check us out at arflightsafety.com. You can donate there. You can also download our interactive GPS products and see the other podcasts that we have. We do have 2 podcasts out on airports, that's Bentonville and North Little Rock, and they both also have associated classes that you can take on FAAsafety.gov. So those are wings courses that you can take and get wings credit just for listening to a podcast, which I think is pretty cool. So thanks again for listening or watching, and I will see you next time. Thanks.